Welcome to our talk. We are Thijs Alkmaar and Daan Keuper, and we, together with our colleague Khaled Nassar, we are the research department of Computest. Computest is a security company from the Netherlands. We're office in Zoetermeer. They do security services like pen testing, incident response, with managed SOC, red teaming. But we are the research department, which means that we don't do work for customers, but we do research for public benefit, research projects that help society, make it a bit safer, but also being able to talk about the research that we do. And one of the activities that we like to do is Pwn to Own. This is a hacking competition. In case you're not familiar with it yet, it's very different from a CTF. So the idea behind Pwn to Own is that it's a competition for finding actual zero-day vulnerabilities in existing software. So it's organized by a company called CDI, and a few months before the actual event, they set out a few targets. They tell you you're going to get this reward if you manage to hack it. And then teams start working on them, typically at least for a few months or a few weeks. And then at the event, they just go there, they run their exploits to demonstrate that it works. And then you get a reward. So the reward depends on whether there are other teams targeting the same thing as well. Typically, the first team that successfully demonstrates a vulnerability gets a full reward, but any later teams get a lower reward. And if you have the same vulnerability as another team, your reward's even lower again because, they don't want people to share their vulnerabilities. So we participated in Pwn to Own now 3 times. So the first time was in 2021 with Zoom, which was very important at that time. And then a year later, we looked at industrial control systems, like the computer systems used in factories. And earlier this year, in January, there was a new edition, one focused on automotive, where we also participated. It had various targets, like it had a Tesla with different subcomponents of the Tesla. There were automotive operating systems, infotainment systems, and the targets that we had the most success with that were EV chargers. And for 3 different EV chargers, we had exploits, which means that we could take them over, get full control over the device, just run arbitrary code. And for all 3 of them, we had a way to do this just by being in Bluetooth range. So we didn't need to be on the same network. We didn't need to have like a password or whatever for the device. We just stand somewhere near it, connect to it, and we can take it over. So we did that with 3 different devices. This is a Juicebox 40, the Autel Maxi Charger, and the ChargePoint Home Flex. And all of them have similar functionality. Like these are home chargers. So this is something you get installed at home, but typically you need an electrician to install this, but they're not superchargers. They don't go for the very high energy. And they have similar functionality, like they have an app, you can do scheduled charging, you can see how much energy has been used already, that sort of thing. And all of them were like typically IoT level of security. Clearly not much thought has been put into the development of this firmware. So this was, for 2 of them, anybody in Bluetooth range could just connect to them. There was no authentication on that part at all. And for the 3rd one, there was some authentication, but it had a backdoor in it. So anybody who had that backdoor token could just connect to it. Now, sadly, we don't have that much time today, so we cannot really talk about all 3 of them. We're going to focus on the ChargePoint Home Flex. But if you want to know more about the other chargers and how we perform research, or if you want to do something like this yourself, we have full write-ups for all 3 of them. I think we posted the latest one today on our website. So we're trying to help other people do research like this, maybe on the same target or similar targets. So that's why we also publish full write-ups on what we did and how we approach our research. So the ChargePoint Home Flex, this one is a bit different from the other 2 because this one runs Linux. But we did first need to extract the firmware for this from this charger. This is our setup for doing that. This charger, it would boot Linux and it would boot automatically, so we couldn't tell it to change how it was booting. we could connect over Telnet, but there was a password, root password that we didn't have. But luckily we could have, JTAG was enabled on the device, which typically is disabled in production devices. But luckily for us, this was not disabled here. So during boot, we could pause the bootloader, tell it to not automatically boot its configuration that was saved, but then just make it wait a bit so we can change the boot configuration, add a new user so we can log into it, and then we had access to the device while it was running. And why did we need to do it? Well, we didn't have the firmware for this device, so we don't really know how this kind of thing updates itself. We know nothing, so we need to know what code is running on there. So we needed to extract that first. So by just following these steps, getting access via the hardware, we were able to just copy all of the files once we had access. Now, one thing that differed from the other two chargers from this one is that there was prior research for this charger. Kaspersky in 2018 looked at the same charger, and they wrote a full report on this with how they researched it, what kind of things they found, and made all of this public. And back then, they found that there was a buffer overflow, a stack buffer overflow, when you set the Wi-Fi password. So typically how these chargers work is you connect over Bluetooth to the charger. The first time you set it up, you give it your Wi-Fi password or the password for your Wi-Fi network and the name, and then it connects to that, and then you don't need to use Bluetooth anymore. So there was one packet that you needed to send, and there was a buffer overflow in that. So of course, this was 6 years ago. You don't expect new vulnerabilities there. Well, not in the service itself. So the way that this works is you send first a password. It goes to a binary called onboardee. And there's some inter-process communication happening to a binary called VLAN app, which handles all of the setup for the Wi-Fi password. And typically how these devices work with Wi-Fi is that they don't use a password itself, but they derive a key from the password immediately. But they didn't want to implement this. They saw there's a command for that. So they just copy all of the data into a shell command and execute it without any verification or escaping or whatever. So yeah, this is a straightforward example of a command injection. You just put a double quote in there and then some semicolon or whatever, and then you can run extra commands. So this charger, I think this one we ordered end of October. So all of these chargers were American models, so we had to order them on Amazon, and it took weeks for them to ship to us. We ordered this one end of October, but then Amazon lost their package. They told me it was probably delivered. They really said probably, but hadn't shown up. So we had to reorder it at like December 1st, I think. So it was like almost Christmas when this thing came in, and it was getting near the competition. So we really had only a few days to work on this charger. And Daan and Gert were doing all of this JTAG stuff with the U-boot and whatever. And then within a day they had this, and they had this command injection, and I was like, I don't believe you guys. You're saying this is way too easy. No way that this actually works here. But yeah, it did work. And as I mentioned before, the competition, you get a lower reward if other teams have the same vulnerability. And we hoped sort of that there might not be that many entrants for this competition, but that turned out to be completely wrong, because there were 7 entries for this charger, and we were 7th out of the 7. And then, we saw the attempts on the first day, and we don't really know which vulnerabilities they are using, of course, because they are still 0 days, so they need to keep that quiet. But we saw on the schedule that the first team succeeded, but then all of the following teams all collided. So this made it very likely to us, if you look at the prior research from Kaspersky, that everybody just had looked at the same parts and everybody had the same bugs. So we were there in Tokyo, and we're a bit annoyed because we just know that we're going to dupe on this. So then we sort of started to look at it a bit further, and I'm going to hand it over to Daan for this part.
Yes, so we had around 12 hours remaining before our entry was due. So it was around 9 p.m. in the evening, and we're like, okay, fuck it. we're just going to try find something new. We have nothing better to do. We went clubbing 3 nights in a row, so we thought, okay, this night we're going to just spend all night, see if we can find a better vulnerability to avoid a bug collision. So this all was made possible because our hotel had a beer vending machine, which kept us awake all night. So at least I was a little bit sleep deprived. We were jet lagged, so we couldn't sleep the night prior. We went clubbing a couple of times, so we hadn't slept in a couple of nights. But due to this vending machine, we pulled an all-nighter trying to find a different vulnerability that might not collide during the competition. So we didn't actually have the charger with us because we thought that might pose problems with customs if you bring a charger through customs. Turns out that's not true because we got a new charger from the competition leader for further research. So we took that back in my backpack, and no problems at customs whatsoever. No questions asked. So apparently you can just bring your EV charger across the border. So we didn't actually have the charger with us. We did have one in the office where we could remotely log into. So every Bluetooth vector was now out of the question because we didn't have the charger to actually test any vulnerabilities we might find in the Bluetooth packet handling. So we were bound to network attacks. So this is the services that the charger is actually running. It has a telnet daemon running at all times, but since we didn't know the root passwords, we deemed it uninteresting. It had an outgoing WebSocket connection to the ChargePoint cloud. And we looked at this prior, but it seems to validate the certificate. So we also deemed that uninteresting. And it had an outgoing SSH connection that would actually fail because the service it was trying to connect to would no longer existed. But the service was a bit strange. It would connect to some cloud service, and it would use that to reverse proxy the telnet port to the charger. I'm guessing this is some kind of maintenance daemon. Like this way, ChargePoint will always have telnet access to every charger to do emergency maintenance or support. But yeah, since we already had access to the telnet port, if you were on the same network, we also deemed that SSH connection not that interesting from an attacker point of view. So we decided to go back to that WebSocket connection for a little bit to see if certificate validation was indeed correctly implemented, or maybe they use an outdated version of some SSL library that would contain vulnerabilities, or maybe we could make it drop back to an HTTP connection or something. So this is the configuration file. Here you see the URL that it would connect to during normal operation. And you would indeed see that it has the verify hostname setting set to 1, which we assumed would make it set to true and would indeed verify the hostname. We looked at the binary a bit more, and we learned that it used curl for all the WebSocket communication, and that this setting was actually setting the SSL verify host option in curl. So looking a bit more closely at these values, well, actually there are 3 values. You have 0, which means don't do any verification, and you have 2, which means do certificate validation, and there you have 1, and 1 is a bit of a foot gun, like it's some sort of debug value that was also promptly removed from curl because nobody understood this correctly, of course. Luckily, ChargePoint didn't update their curl library in quite some time, so it was earlier than version 7.28. And what version 1 means, it will check if the certificate is signed by a valid CA, but it wouldn't check the domain name. That's basically what it said. But a valid certificate or signed by a valid CA in this situation means that it needs to be signed by a certificate from ChargePoint. But luckily the device had just a certificate for us because it also uses client-side authentication. So we could just extract, and it was signed by the same root key. So we could just extract that certificate and use that to man in the middle the WebSocket connection. So at this time, it was around midnight. Beer started kicking in. We were slightly past our Balmer peak at this point. And we were researching this from a hotel in Tokyo with a drum and bass from a crappy audio laptop speaker. And the charger was, of course, in our office in the Netherlands. But it was near 5 p.m., so the office would close. So we were like, okay. At this point, we also learned that we were running the incorrect firmware on our charger. So we already knew, like, okay, if we crash that thing, we have no way to log it back into it or do any further research. So whatever vulnerability we find, it needs to be easily exploitable. Because if it crashes, we're done. We also learned, because we have the old firmware, that most offsets are most likely wrong. So any memory corruption where you need offsets also will most likely not work. So we thought, okay, we really need a simple vulnerability here, like something like an arbitrary file write or just a system command injection would all do the job. So we spent the entire night trying to find a message that would lead to arbitrary code execution. This is the format of the messages that go over that bus. We spent all night. It was quite messy because the whole IPC layer made it very difficult to see where each message would go to. But in the end, we found a message that we could send where it would extract something from that message, from the payload it would receive from the cloud, and it would directly slap it into a system command. I have no idea what the normal uses of this command is, but we had straight up command execution. So we wrote the report, went on the metro without any sleep to the venue, and luckily it worked. We were the 7th team, but we found a new vulnerability that it didn't dupe. So we're very glad we managed to pull this off. Yeah. So I'm also seeing that we're nearing the break, but I want to go back for 1 second to that SSH connection. Because we also looked a little bit deeper into that silly SSH connection. And this is the init script that actually spawns that shell service, SSH service. It has several hosts that it can connect to based on in which year the device was produced. It had one for 2016, 2017. Of course, we're now in 2024, and it didn't have any host for that year. So it would just fall back to the normal URL, the default value. So, but that host was no longer online. So we tried, hey, can we maybe with our charger log into any of the other hosts, like the older versions? And it turned out we could. Our SSH key would work on one of those older systems. They call it the mothership. So this is basically what it does. Based on your serial number, it would claim a port, and it would open a reverse proxy to your local telnet daemon. And we could log in. We tried, of course, if we could get a shell, but that didn't work. So they had thought about this a little bit. But then we thought, okay, if we can do reverse proxies, we can also do forward proxies. So can we maybe connect to other chargers via this host? So we tried some other stuff to see if we could get that to work. And indeed, we could connect to other telnet services of other chargers. But of course, we didn't have the root password, so yeah, that wasn't very useful. So then we thought, okay, can we maybe connect them to other hosts outside of charge points, like an open proxy sort of thing? Well, that also works. If you can make one tunnel, you can probably make more tunnels. So, okay, cool finding. Open proxy, maybe not very useful, but okay. Until we learned that this service is hosted on AWS. We're like, and we connect to the meta service of AWS. Well, it turns out we can. So we extracted all kinds of access keys to that this specific instance had. We're like, okay, I hope this instance doesn't have much access to some of the charge point resources. So we thought, okay, let's list S3 buckets. Oh, wow. They had 142 S3 buckets. We had read primitives on all of them, it seemed. Some have very interesting name with prods, but also PAI, data lake, payment details, etc. We stopped our research here because this was outside of the scope of the competition. But yeah, it was interesting because 2 weeks ago or so, there were some questions in Parliament about some research that you could control like 4 million solar panels, and that could have a very negative impact on the electricity grid if you can control so much solar panels at once. But if you think about it, this problem is of course much bigger than only solar panels. There are much more devices that either consume a lot of power or produce a lot of power that are all connected to some cloud of some manufacturer that didn't really take security into account. So with that in mind, I would say if you want to know more about our research, please go to our website. You can find all 3 write-ups of all 3 chargers. If you're interested in participating in Pontoon, there's one coming up in October. There are some crappy IP cameras as targets, so I'm sure you're going to have fun. And if there are any more questions, I'm willing to answer some questions. Thank you.
Had to grab that first. Are there any questions from the audience? Nobody? Everybody wants to go for a break? Can we then please have another big round of applause for